The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
If it's not in frame, it doesn't exist.
I am big. It's the picture that got small.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
Really? Worst film you ever saw? Well, my next one will be better. Hello? Hello?
You want to see it again?
Can we?
And just like the movies, we play out our last.
You are listening to the History on Film podcast. And now here are your hosts, Ross Lennon and Ryan Barr.
Hello, and welcome to another interview edition of the History on Film podcast. I'm your host, Ross Lennon. I am not joined this week by my close friend and colleague, Ryan Barr. Let's say he is solving crimes in Los Angeles this week. He's on the case of the real Black Dahlia murderer. But joining me today is Dr. Claudia Calhoun. She is the Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at Hunter College and the author of Only the Names Have Been Changed, Dragnet, the Police Procedural, and Postwar Culture. Dr. Calhoun, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you wrote a book, and I was heaping praise on you earlier about it. It came to me at a great time because I was starting to look into Dragnet. And so I just want to start because it is this huge cultural phenomenon beginning in the 40s. And then you, even into the 80s, you have the film that Ryan and I have talked about a few times on this show. But it seems like even though Dragnet itself is gone, we live in this world that even still so much of culture is heavily shaped by Dragnet. So let's just start at the very beginning. What is Dragnet?
So Dragnet is a police procedural, which means that it follows a case kind of step by step from beginning to end, from crime to punishment, is how Dragnet would put it. And so that distinguishes it a little bit from any other kind of crime drama or police drama, where the emphasis might be on what the criminals are doing or on action sequences. But instead, this is about the work of the police. So Dragnet is a police procedural that started on radio, as you mentioned, in 1949, and then moved to television in 1951 and ran both on radio and television for several years, and then kind of ended that first run in 1959. It came back in the mid-60s, first as a TV movie and then as a series. And then, as you mentioned, came back a couple of more times, came back most prominently in the 1980s with the parody with Tom Hanks.
And so how did this show come about? Because there were crime and police shows before this. Really, I think of the Keystone Cops, way back in the very early days of cinema. But so how did Dragnet come about?
That's right. Police shows have been part of media since there have been police. What was interesting about Dragnet in its time was the way that it presented what it understood as a new kind of realism in the police drama. So every generation has its own police stories and has its own quote unquote realistic police stories. So in the 1930s on radio, there was Gangbusters. In the 1950s, it was Dragnet. In the 1980s on television, it was Hill Street Blues. In the 1990s on television, it was Law and Order. So every few years, every generation, there's a new television series or a new radio show that says this is a more realistic view into how the police work, but what that looks like varies. So for Dragnet, what was particularly distinctive about it was the way that it pulled all of the emotion out of the show. So it really sought to, when they say take you step by step, like really be very quite dull about it, right? So that you have in the Dragnet, you listen or watch, right? He'll call out time codes, right? At 8:57 we arrived here, at 9:15 we arrived here. And so that kind of pedantism was part of Dragnet's realist aesthetic.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of one of those misattributed quotes or like misremembered quotes, but like, you mentioned Dragnet and a lot of things people say is, oh, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Like, and it's so funny. I mean, I was a kid, and I remember Rugrats made a Dragnet reference where they're like, oh, just the facts, just the facts.
This is our fax machine. Our company cover letter is rather clever. It says, just the facts. Like the TV show, just the facts, ma'am.
We think television is evil.
Key piece of Dragnet trivia, right? So you say just the facts, and somebody says, oh, he never really said that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that line doesn't appear in the show, but one of the reasons it resonates so deeply is because it does capture the feel of the show. The
Mm-hmm.
show is to an understanding, a presentation of what it understands as just the facts. And so it really captures the show and its impact.
Yeah, sort of like how little Timmy never fell down a well on Lassie, but it speaks to a broader emotional truth,
right,
about these shows.
That feels like Timmy is always falling down the well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so how did the change from radio to TV impact the show?
I think one of the things, if people are familiar with the television show, I think one of the things that can be surprising about listening to the radio show is how everything is already in place for the most part. So the structure of the show is in place, how the narratives are unfolds is in place, the characters are in place. So what happened by the time Dragnet got to television, what you saw in television was really a visualization of its radio aesthetic. That visualization turned out to be really impactful, in part because television was being invented, right? The forms of television were being invented, but the realism, that idea, that approach to realism was largely established on radio. So television, one of the things that was influential about Dragnet on television was its attention to close-ups. And so a lot of different shows were filmed a lot of different ways in the early period. And it was Dragnet's use of close-up in the show. If you go back and watch those early episodes, is almost entirely dialogue based and goes back and forth in these close-ups. So it's not just that he's using the close-ups, but also that they're a key part of how the show communicates. And so that was very visible and like commented upon when Dragnet was on television.
And so what were the police shows like before Dragnet? Because you do talk about that in the book too, and I think one of the examples you gave was like Dick Tracy.
Oh, Dick Tracy. I don't know about Dick Tracy on radio. The Gangbusters and Calling All Cars were kind of the two foils, I think, of the book. I'm sure that I'm thinking about the Dick Tracy comics, although I'm sure there's at least one Dick Tracy radio experiment, I'm sure. But before that, I think that what they would certainly have in common is the idea of like this very action-based narrative. So it would be about like, the whirring sirens and the screeching and the screeching tires. So just in terms of on radio, that like aesthetic that emphasizes those not exaggerated sounds, although there certainly were exaggerated, I'm sure, but those kind of high intensity moments. What also was true of a show like Gangbusters is that there was a dual narrative. So it followed the narrative on one side of the police and on the other side of the criminals. And it would go back and forth between those two. And so you would get the police having their little conversations about what they were going to do next. And then you would go into the den of criminals and they would be having their conversations about whatever dastardly plans that they were making, and back and forth. And so another of Dragnet's interventions was to drop out that criminal storyline. So we stay with the police perspective for the whole time.
And Dragnet also comes alongside a push for modernization and professionalization in policing. How does Dragnet reflect the changes to actual police work in the 1950s?
Dragnet is really interesting in that way because it's set amongst the Los Angeles Police Department culture. And so it's not only that in a lot of other crime shows, they might say this is the FBI but like they're not really, it really could be any police department. And the relationship between Dragnet and the LAPD was just much closer than most relationships between a police presentation and the police that inspire it. And so what that meant was that for Dragnet captured changes being made by the LAPD in the 1950s, and the LAPD in that post-war period was a national and to some extent like international as well model for professionalizing police force in that period. So there were other moments historically where of police professionalization in the 1930s with the FBI was one of those moments. So it wasn't the only time that police sought to professionalize, but and the LAPD had a few distinctive characteristics of professionalization. One of them was the character of the police chief, William H. Parker, who was a very public figure, very strident figure, very abrasive figure, and in a lot of ways a very effective leader for the LAPD, even as he put into place what some later described as a quasi-militaristic police force. Or not, it was a quasi-militaristic police force in that it embraced some of the organization of the military. So it's not just that people said that. It was that some people felt that it was an occupying police force, depending on how they and their neighborhoods were being policed by the LAPD. So for professionalization for William H. Parker and the 50s LAPD meant the incorporation of a more militaristic structure that at which Parker stood at the apex. It involved it involved an attempt to control vice or to remove some of the problems that had plagued the LAPD for years, bribery, all sorts of scandals. You mentioned the Black Dahlia murder, right? Right? So the LAPD was dealing with that with a tough reputation. And so to respond to that, Parker instituted, and others who were working with him, instituted these policies that created distance between the police and the citizens. One marker of that Dragnet records is the move from more walkable beats, like the beat policing we might be familiar with, to policing by car, which was also a way to respond to the fact of Los Angeles's growth in the post-war period. So because it was hard for a small police force to cover the whole city. And so there are a lot of other ways in which the police try to create certain kinds of distance in order to remove the possibility for police to be corrupted. At the same time, it also kept police distance from the citizens that they were supposed to serve and protect. So as it rolled out, it turned out that style of policing was not beneficial for a lot of communities who were targeted by the police rather than supported by the police. And Dragnet captures the parts of the professionalization that led to kind of whatever might be an honest interaction between the police and the citizens, but it didn't capture the parts that felt like distance, and that distance being then kind of filled with oppression, basically.
Yeah, and so in last week's episode, we talked about the film The Narcotics Story, and how that was a police training film that sort of managed to get a public release. And we talked about how, like, by visualizing these things, not only does it serve as a way of informing the public of like, hey, here's what we're doing, here's how we're applying science and technology to our job, but it also kind of serves to reinforce to the police, like, hey, don't forget, this is how you're supposed to be, doing your job. You're supposed to be, signing off on this form or whatever, and sort of playing by the rules. So did we see do we have sort of a police response to Dragnet, or?
Yeah, I think I haven't seen the Narcotics Story, but what you're describing are also other elements of professionalization in this moment at the LAPD and other places, like the incorporations you're referring to of scientific knowledge, of technological procedures, of procedures themselves, like as a way to standardize interactions. So Dragnet captures all of that as well. But your question was about the police response. Based on what I've read and seen about Dragnet, the police response was overwhelmingly positive, because it was a good, quote unquote, good representation of the police. I didn't see in my research a lot of granular analysis by police of, we like the show because it does this well, but it doesn't represent this part well. What you get overall, you get the sense the police understand that this show is on their side, and they like having representations that are generous and like quote unquote positive, that give people a hero to kind of if not to root for, to be to sit alongside. And I think the police tended to express real genuine appreciation for Jack Webb for trying to get their job right. The boring parts of it, the tedious parts of it, the unromantic parts of it, and bringing that to radio and then television and film with a kind of with respect.
Yeah, and we probably should introduce Jack Webb at this point, because he is so, I mean, he's Sergeant Friday. Like, he is this singular kind of, like, I knew he was involved in the production end. I did not realize until reading this book, like, this was his, show from like beginning to end. And uh he has like a, big monument in LA, in LA, or I guess his tombstone or something. Like, he's well celebrated in LA and the LAPD, I guess, even still.
That's
So
like the Los Angeles Police Department Museum, where his like materials from Dragnet are prominently on display, or at least were prominently on display in 2018. Maybe they've moved things around, but Dragnet is a part of the story of the LAPD. So Jack Webb, I mean, some people, if you're probably a bunch of your audience has seen Sunset Boulevard, which I think you clip also in your intro.
I am big. It's the picture that got small.
So Jack Webb's an actor. You saw him in Sunset Boulevard if you've seen Sunset Boulevard, and he had some other great roles in films. But he didn't ever like kind of break through into leading man status in film. And he had a smaller part on a film noir called He Walked by Night, which had procedural elements to it. So the police procedural in the Dragnet form didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of these semi-documentary films that came out after World War II. And He Walked by Night was one of those semi-documentary films, but also had these like exaggerated crime elements. And so it's celebrated amongst people who love film noir. And so he played a small part on that show. And while he was there, he met a police officer named Marty Wynn, who was working as a technical advisor. And according to Webb, the story was that Wynn was complaining about how the police are never represented in the way the actual job is done. And that inspired Jack Webb to begin to create Dragnet. So he got the idea on that set and then eventually worked with partners in order to write the script and sell it and then direct it and star in it.
So it's always, it's so funny to me when someone's like, "Hey, I have a great idea for the show, and I know exactly who to cast for the lead." It's like,
yeah, I don't know actually. I don't remember if there was any like pushback or anything like that in terms of him casting himself. I guess because he was established as an actor, and nobody really was too bothered by that. If I remember correctly, it also came in as a summer replacement show, and so I think to some extent there was like a nah.
yeah, exactly. We'll see. We'll see if it sticks. He's like, we had a lot of great people read for us, but I think I won out in the end. So
yeah.
Frank? Yeah, Joe. Got a call in West Fremont. Same neighborhood we had trouble Monday night? Yeah, sounds like it might be the same gang, too. Those kids are sure moving fast. Yeah, did you leave the note for Simmons? Mm-hmm. All set. What is it this time? Movie theater on West Fremont, small neighborhood house. Mm-hmm. They had a crowd of 15 or 20 kids in there today, mixed group, boys and girls. For no reason at all, they started to tear the place up. They do much damage? Well, we can see when we get there. They told me on the phone, theater manager tried to quiet the kids down. Half a dozen boys piled all over him. One of them pulled a knife. They tore up a couple of seats, moved out into the lobby, smashed mirrors, lamps, beat up one of the ushers. Lousy little punks that give a right arm to know how this thing got started. We never had much trouble from the kids in that neighborhood out there, Joe. Not until this last month. They seem to be going crazy. Well, it's not getting any better. Burglaries, car thefts, wrecking property. Somebody's going to come out on the short end if it keeps up. It's got to happen. Well, maybe it already has, Frank. When they were ripping up that theater lobby today, one kid got hurt. What happened? 14-year-old boy. In the mix-up, he got shoved through a display case, plate glass. Cut up pretty bad. On his eyes. I'm not sure he's going to see again.
And then something that has fascinated me is Dragnet claimed to be taken from real police files and that only the names have been changed. But that isn't quite the case. How true was this in actuality? And why was this important to the show's success?
I'll answer the second part first, which is that it was important because it was part of Dragnet's realist aesthetic. was like just being very clear that their intention was to offer this presentation of real life police work. And so kind of essential to that, and that was is the idea of being able to declare that. Like we can say this is based on real stories. And as you know from your research, that's an essential kind of move in a lot of different mediums, telling a lot of different kinds of stories, right? To be able to like declare your realist intention up front. And that was also part of other police procedurals before, police dramas before, like Gangbusters, who would bring in like real life police officers to help announce the show in order to give it that kind of realist weight. And so it was just really important for Dragnet to be able to say that. And in terms of how like real it actually was, is very, there's kind of, there's a couple of ways to kind of approach what that means. Certainly, the individual episodes were inspired by things that happened according to police officers who served in the LAPD. And at different points, police officers were encouraged to send their ideas. And I believe at some points they were paid a small amount of money if their idea was used or something like that. So there were ideas always coming in that writers were encouraged to write. The writer wasn't encouraged to write scripts off of. But there are very few instances in Dragnet where it's easy to trace the specific episode to a specific case. And some of that, of course, is because who's keeping records or who has access to the records of every case ever worked by an LAPD officer, right? There's some like there's a volume issue there.
Yeah,
But
especially
I think also
pre-digitization.
Pre-digitization, and like why would was the LAPD going to put that on their website even if they even if they haven't? Like no. And like those documents will tell a story of their own, right? So like what the real story is always going to be mediated. I think there was a genuine attempt to, like I say, portray police work as it is, at least in the way that the show understood that. There are a couple of, and now I'm going to blank. There are a couple of episodes where you can trace there's like some inspiration, but the episodes that are easiest to figure out what that connection to, when there's in any instance when there's a fictionalization of a real life event, it's the sensational events that are easiest to find the reference for, right? Like if they had done a Black Dahlia murder, then we would be able to say, oh, that's a takeoff of that. But part of what Dragnet obscures its foundations is that it's not interested in the scandalous, the publicized, right? It's really it's interested in the incidents that would never appear in the newspapers. And so I'm kind of talking around it, but like that's to say that like Dragnet has a commitment to realism. It would be hard to track in any case what incidents in LAPD actually inspired actual episodes. And then of course there's just the form itself. So Dragnet is an episodic television show. It has to have a consistent form. Life doesn't have a consistent form. So whatever inspiration that the writers were drawing on would still have to fit within the Dragnet narrative. So kind of all of that is working at the same time.
Yeah, and they do all button up very clean at the end. There's like the ones that I've been looking at for my research all have this very tidy moral component at the end. Because of course the ones I'm watching are all about like juvenile delinquency, and pot especially. So it's like it is interesting that they can sort of use these things, because how I got started looking at this was like, well, they're saying that these are based on true events. I want to see like where are these true events, that they're being based off of. Like there's one where these kids smoke weed and then destroy a movie theater. And it's like, okay, well, you would think I would be able to find, a newspaper article or something about that. But of course, that's all in service of like, telling kids, hey, don't do dope, don't be a dope.
It's hard to track. And it could be that there was where police arrested juvenile delinquents who got high and they destroyed something else, but in order for it to look interesting on the episode, they made a movie theater. And so that's like inspired by true events. Like you can get high and destroy things, but it's not the same as being like a documentary, like in the way that we might expect documentaries to relate to the truth today.
Yeah, sort of like using low stakes enough crime to imply like this is happening so much, that we're just kind of doing it rote by like we're dealing with this over and over and over again, and sort of like laundering this one-time event that may or may not have happened to the extent that it did, to say like, can you believe that this is happening everywhere all the time?
I think that's right. And I think that's like that is part of the point that Dragnet makes ideologically, is why kind of how it's on the side of the police is this idea that there's this like ever present, persistent threat to everybody's community. So it's not about the serial killers, although every now and again, like a murder will show up, but it is about the robberies and the thefts and the assaults and the kind of the smaller crimes. They do bigger crimes as well, but just like that, the idea of like that consistent, persistent threat that the police then have to always be present for. There's an argument there about the need for the police in the focus, as you point out, on these smaller crimes that are pose a persistent threat.
And I think it kind of mirrors what we're seeing in terms of foreign policy at the time as well. So we talked about Strategic Air Command, which came out in 1955, where they say explicitly, hey, we have to have, nuclear armed bomber planes ready to go at any time because, this crime is out there, or, because this communism is out there 24/7. We have to be armed so that we never have to use it. Where with Dragnet, it's like, hey, we have to have the police out there 24/7 so that we don't need to, like, it's this sort of like perpetualization of criminality as a justification for more policing.
I think so. And there's some interesting intersections between like militarization and post-war. So one of the arguments in the book is, or at least that the book suggests, is that and there's this buildup during World War II for the US, like of capacity, right? Industrial capacity, military capacity. And so then after the war in peacetime, where does that go? And so to some extent, culturally, it moves into the police procedural. Like where does this institutionalized, professionalized, like kind of like organization man with with a gun and authority, like where do they go? They go so often like quite practically into the police force. And that also happened kind of historically, right? Where did the military machinery get utilized after World War II? A lot of it was bought by police departments, or in Chief Parker's case, and of bringing in that militaristic structure into the police force was part of the long effects of World War II, which then also gets transformed into some of these like Cold War expressions as well. So there are things happening domestically, and then there are things happening in terms of foreign policy that intersect, don't always overlap. There's a kind of hysteria in Cold War documents that is decidedly absent from Dragnet. But I think your point about like the idea of like a persistent threat, just it's out there, the persistent threat that's out there, like the nuclear war one, like that threat tends to be a little bit expressed more hysterically. There's also this domestic threat that is also persistent, but that we can control, right? Dragnet suggests like we can control with a professionalized police force with the cooperation of citizens.
And then just it didn't even really click in my head until I read Sarah Seo's book, Policing the Open Road, about how, I mean, probably prior to World War II, the police, I mean, it was just a hodgepodge. And, sort of the value of watching like those Keystone Cop stuff is that early police cars weren't even marked necessarily, like it took someone to eventually say like, hey, we should probably put a siren on this, because she opens her book with like somebody was being followed by a police car, didn't know it was a police car, thought they were being chased, and got into a car accident, and everybody died. And so it's like, I think the thing about this professionalization is that so much of our conception of policing culture is departed from that very early, like slapdash. It was a comedy, like the Keystone Cops were a comedy, but it's like they were speaking to a real sense of like these people have no idea what they're doing, you know?
Right, they're these comic figures with, although with batons, right? Like, so
Yeah.
there's a kind of like undercutting, but that does acknowledge, as you say, like kind of the danger of this of foolishness that's happening with these people who've been empowered to police. And there are, I think you point out, I think correctly, that there are aspects of professionalization that we might want. If we're going to have a police force, then we want there to be forms. We want there to be marked cars. You know, we want there to be a structure. We want there to be technology, like if we're going to have a police force. But the ideology of professionalization as one that's kind of like a neutral good, like that's the real problem, because
Right.
professionalization can also hide, just like Dragnet did, a lot of issues that then can't be addressed if we insist that professionalization solves problems that it actually enables or causes or hides.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want, you know, Joe Friday crashing into our chicken coop, but we also don't want him, you know, like running roughshod all over the town. So
Exactly.
and so you write about the saturation of Dragnet and the cross-media impact that it had on 1950s America. How did it shape and change the media ecosystem that it existed in? Because this is, you know, like you said, radio and then the very early days of television. This is one of the first hit shows, right?
That's right. It's one of the first hit shows and had a long legacy as one of the first hit shows. So it has different kind of influences. It's so influential on the police procedural genre that persists. It was influential in terms of how it kind of presented aesthetically, like its interest in form and making experiments with form. I didn't mention before, but should have, but Dragnet was shot on film at a time when prestige television was live. And so it was, so one of the things that Dragnet and the creators of Dragnet Webb and his compatriots were working out was, what should a TV show shot on film look like? And then later, once you have something on film, that means you can syndicate it.
Yes.
Much more that in much better quality than like showing kinescopes, right? Circulating kinescopes, which was that this was discovered by different people at the same time, right? I Love Lucy was also shot on film.
That's exactly what I was thinking of, is this, and I Love Lucy created the rerun. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. The rerun, and then the after the post broadcast revenue stream. So if if you have something that's live, you have to restage that in order to make money from it again. But film is much more flexible for that purpose. So I think that Dragnet's biggest influence is on television. So at the time, in terms of how it influenced the structure, how it kind of showed how you can shoot something on film in ways that are impactful and that allow it to be syndicated. Yeah, so Dragon's biggest influence was on television in terms of its form and its quality, in terms of shooting on film, in terms of like just the thoughtfulness with which it was experimenting with the form. And then it was also just kind of existed in culture in this very broad way. It's of course not the only media artifact that was circulating in the 1950s and across media. So I was in my class recently, we were talking about the Lone Ranger and looking at like the Lone Ranger, which also started on radio, which also moved into television, which also was on lunch boxes and cowboy hats and the masks and all of that sort of thing. So there were a number of shows that were impactful in that way. I think what's a little bit unusual about Dragnet is that it was so impactful for really such a not a boring show, but a show that's not action based, right? It's not the same. A kid is not going to put on a suit and walk around their neighborhood pretending to be Joe Friday. But there was something about the way that it resonated that allowed it to be picked up by other populations, so that a tagline like "Just the Facts" showed up like in many different contexts, showed up 50 years later in Rugrats. And there was something that really hit. It exists. One of the things that you can kind of see with Dragnet is just that it's a very different media environment than today. So we talked today in media studies about convergence, right? And the distinctions between mediums as collapsed and overlapping. And what you see in the 1950s with Dragnet is that Dragnet exists in multiple different mediums, but doesn't have the same kind of synergistic relationship that we might expect from like a Marvel property today, in the way that it kind of expands across like mediums in ways that look more seamless and more integrated. And so, but the Dragnet did have, so it was on radio at the same time, it was on television. There was a comic strip, a newspaper comic strip for a while. There were the themes show was a hit. It was like a recorded, like as a record. It just was kind of like everywhere, and really provided new language and a new understanding for the police, for how people talked about how the police worked. And that may not have been convincing to everyone who was using those utterances. Certainly people who were policed by in ways that Dragnet did not represent, they would not have understood that show to be as realistic as it was presenting. But just the way that it really shaped the way that people talked about how the police worked, both in its own form and then through the persistence of the police procedural as a genre on television, right? As a foundational television genre.
Yeah, I want to talk about the legacy of the police procedural in a little bit. But yeah, it's interesting. And so Dragnet was the first show to ever be rebooted. So why did it come back and what changed? Other than the fact that now it's in color.
Well, as a quote, like a media historian, every time I say a first, I have to like there's an asterisk, right? So I'm going to say that somebody is going to call in or whatever the equivalent say we found an earlier one. But certainly I believe it was 1966 that the Dragnet television movie came back, or they made a TV movie out of Dragnet. And at the time, that was remarkable. So there are people at the time saying this has never happened before, whether it's happened before or not historically. But there are people at the time who were saying this has never happened before. And it was weird, as far as I've known. They're very unusual for a TV show to be off the air, or a radio show to be off the air truly for 10 years and then come back in a different form. So in that way, then this idea of like the reboot was also not part of the media ecosystem at that time. And so Dragnet showed that was possible to do. So Dragnet came back as first as a TV movie, and then it did so well that it was picked up for a series. And I ran, I think, is it 3 years? 67 to 70, I think it did, second incarnation. I think there are two main differences. As you point out, there's color. And so that just gives the whole thing a different feel than the 1950s one, which had to be in black and white, but also black and white really matched. It's not exactly grittiness, but the kind of, it's unvarnished. The fact that like the idea that unvarnished presentation, black and white really matched that. And so there's a brightness to the 60s version that like some might argue is a little bit at odds with the way that Dragnet presents itself, but you had to in 1967 your TV show had to be in color. Like so that was what was in any case. But I think there's also that Dragnet just read really differently in the 1960s in ways that probably, that a contemporary audience sees immediately, right? If you watch 1967 Dragnet and it feels over the top and feels stylized, for some audiences, it was over the top and stylized. But for a lot of audiences as well, it was just a return of something familiar that they enjoyed. And so the stylization that was present also in the 1950s, but was in a different context, and when the medium was working itself out, right? Dragnet in the 50s is also stylized, but it's constructed outside of a realist aesthetic. And then in the 1960s, because television has evolved since then with different forms and looks different, then when you put that Dragnet aesthetic in that context, then it also just stands out more. And then Dragnet engaged in the culture wars in the 1960s in the way that it just simply did not in the 1950s. So there, as we talked before about like an interest in not telling sensational stories, right? And not being over the top, but just trying to do like in committing to the factsness of the show. And in the 60s, there are just more episodes where it's clear that the generation that's creating Dragnet is like at odds with the younger generation that's being policed. So if you're watching, like you said, you were watching like the shows about drugs, those are the most moralistic. So a lot of 60s dragnets that look a lot like 50s dragnets. They're just about somebody writing a bad check, and you're just like, and the police are trying to find the person who wrote the bad check. And then there are episodes where if somebody is smoking marijuana or on LSD or experimenting with mushrooms or whatever, and the show expresses a much stronger opinion about that behavior, like the use of drugs, but then also kind of everything that the show associates with it, right? A kind of just like of irresponsibility represented by the youth of today. And there's a lot more speechifying in 60s Dragnet. There's a lot more of like Sergeant Friday like standing his ground and like telling somebody else like this is not the way to live, and that was much more muted in the 50s. It was to some extent was present there, but what's more interesting about the 40s and 50s Dragnet is the way that the show tended to elect not to moralize. So instead it would present a few different perspectives, but the real problem was the violation of the law. It wasn't how people chose to live, right? The show may have some judgments about that, or may encourage the audience to have some judgments about that, but it often wasn't explicit. It wasn't explicitly said by Friday, you're wrong, everything you believe is wrong, what you're doing is wrong, you're destroying your community. Like that kind of like distance, that's a feature of the 1960s.
Yeah, and there's an iconic scene in the 60s one where Joe Friday and Harry Morgan's character, I forget his name, are talking to a guy who's like, I think he says he's 23 and he's smoking pot. And the conversation is, young man, and I'll cut it in here for everybody to enjoy, but, it's like, hey, young man, you're going to ruin your life. And he says, but we all know that the gateway drug stuff is all bunk. And, my generation, once we grow up and start wearing ties, we're going to change the law. And it like gives what we would hear like more of beginning in the 70s of like, look, we all know that, what you're saying is absolutely as much propaganda as everything else. But the show ultimately comes down on Joe Friday's side where it's like, no, if you smoke pot, it's not, just to make your back feel better. It is, you're going to end up, ODing on heroin. And so it's so interesting that it really does take this, especially in the age of the counterculture, like this unpopular stance gives a voice to what a lot of people, rightly believe, and then just says, now we're going to smack that down.
Have you been smoking marijuana?
Marijuana's illegal, I know that.
That's right.
For now. In a couple of years, things may change when all the kids grow up and start wearing ties and going to the polls. Marijuana's going to be like liquor, packaged and taxed and sold right off the shelf.
I doubt it, Mr. Shipley.
Look, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it seems to me there must be better things for cops to do than chase down wild rumors about something as innocent as marijuana. Why don't you go after the big bad guys, the heroin peddlers? I won't argue with you about them. They should be stopped.
That's right. We'd like to put them out of business. That's why we're here.
What do you mean?
We're trying to keep them from getting a new customer.
There's a big difference between marijuana and hard narcotics.
Yeah, but it's only a small step.
And everybody who takes a drink is going to be an alcoholic. We know that's not true, don't we? Let's face it, we're on opposite sides of the fence and there's nothing we can do about it. For you, if there's a law against it, it's wrong, black and white. I just don't see things that way, that's all.
Well, you ought to give it a try, fella. It might keep you out of jail.
Maybe, but we'll change the law someday, even though your friend here thinks we won't. Believe me, it's a new world. Your laws are as outdated as bustles. Laws are going to have to be changed to keep pace with the new morality. They'll change or we'll have to break them.
What about your daughter? How's she going to feel if you end up in jail?
She won't like it any more than I will, but you'll have to catch me before you can arrest me, won't you? In the meantime, it's a big game of hide and seek, and to me, it is a waste of time.
How old are you, Shipley?
23.
Isn't it about time you grew up?
Here we go, lecture number 131A.
No, I'm not going to give you a lecture. I don't have the time. I'm just going to lay it out for you straight. Now, you listen to me. You chippy around with marijuana long enough, and you're going to buy yourself a lot of grief. After a while, marijuana won't be enough. You'll start looking for a bigger kick, and then a bigger one after that. And all of this is going to go down the tubes. Your job, your house, car, family, everything. We've seen it happen before. And not just to the neurotics and psychotics that wife of yours talks about, but to nice, clean-cut kids from good families with good educations. They start out just like you, and they end up mainliners, shooting it in their arms. And they end up dead, or wishing they were.
That's right. And then the earlier version, it just wouldn't smack it down necessarily.
Yeah.
Just kind of leave it. But that like kind of last like in like that last point that Friday makes about like, no, you're wrong. No, this is the wrong way to live. No, this is a violation of the law. You can't ever go against the law. If you have a problem with the law, then your problem is to challenge the law through the routes that are available to you as a citizen. Kind of that insistence on following, in that case, like a procedure, right? Like there's a way to do things. And often in the 60s Dragnet, there's the people who they're engaged with are doing things the wrong way.
Right. It almost feels like a protean form of like some sort of terrible right-wing meme where it's like, Joe Friday schools, kid with reason and logic. It's just, ugh.
There is, in some extent, to a degree, I'm like a surprise that some of those clips haven't been like pulled out and circulated in social media. I mean, it looks a little bit silly. I don't know why a right-wing person would choose that particular aesthetic to circulate because it does look out of time. But they are very clippable, those speeches or those step downs. And it's the problem, of course, is like it's the lack of nuance, to me, right? The first level of problem is the lack of nuance rather than the position itself. Like you can agree that the laws might be changed or that there may be like, I don't want to say good people on both sides because that's horrible now. But you see that like there's ideas that you might believe with that are held by people who are different stances, but that at least like emotion for an interest in some kind of like moral ambiguity or any kind of ambiguity. It just doesn't exist in the same way in the 60s. And that's the problem more than the format, because as we've seen, the format can contain different things. Just in the 60s, it just didn't.
Yeah, and on a similar note, I was trying to decide because I'm mostly focused academically on the 50s stuff, but of course I've seen in reruns my whole life much of the 60s stuff. And I was trying to decide, like, was it camp on purpose or was it just that it was so of that moment that like the aesthetic and the tone, like it just became the definition of camp, like later on.
I don't think that Jack Webb had an understanding of camp.
Yeah.
Like maybe in his private life there might have been some campy moments, but I've never seen anything in his artistic expression, his creative expression, that was anything less than straightforward. In the context, in that 60s context, the show read really differently and reads really differently. But it being heightened, that's more of like I think that points us back to the fact that like that context had changed rather than the intentions of the show had changed.
And then you close the book by talking about Dragnet's legacy. How has Dragnet's influence on the police procedural persisted to this day?
I think to the extent to which Dragnet is influential, like some of it you still see in culture. So when somebody says just the facts, or when somebody, you see characters that look a lot like Joe Friday show up in different kinds of shows, and whether they know it or not, they're kind of referencing that kind of presentation of the police. But as you, I think, correctly point out, its biggest influence has been on television, and particularly the development of the television police procedural. There's no Law and Order without Dragnet, which means that there's no FBI without Dragnet, which means that there's no Special Victims Unit without Dragnet. There's no Reno 911 without Dragnet. No, Reno 911 you can make without Dragnet. There's no 911 without Dragnet. Actually, maybe not, actually. You might not be able to make Reno 911 without Dragnet.
I love Reno 911. And, you said that. And of course, that show is pure Keystone Cops. But I think the fact that at least some of those characters, like, I think Lieutenant Dangle wants to be Joe Friday.
I feel like I bring a real joie de vivre to law enforcement. For example, my uniform, I do not wear the regulation uniform. I wear these shorts here. And actually I had to lobby the sheriff's department to get permission to wear these. But my argument was, hey, I'm out there in the streets every day. I got to be able to move like a cheetah. Like a law enforcement cheetah.
Yes. There's a kind of iconicity that's hard to, that Webb and the show put into place, that's hard to fully avoid if you have a police character. Like it just was so much a part of the culture that you're like people are just talking in those terms about the police. And so so I think that people like your characters on Reno 911 like might imagine for a second like that they can put on the suit and do the job. But the form, I think what's really consistent is the format of the show. Like the idea that there's an attempt at realism and that it looks a little bit different, but a lot of it has to do with that step-by-stepness, right? Following through in a it's like a very step-by-step way. That was also, I should say, part of like earlier versions of police procedurals, but that had more like in the 1930s, there was like a series of movies. Like Jimmy Cagney starred in G-Men, which also had procedural elements, but it was Dragnet's like distillation of that. I think that was most influential. And so Law and Order, like Dick Wolf's oeuvre, like all of his shows, starting with Law and Order, he did shows before that, but like so starting with Law and Order, direct reference to Dragnet. We'll tell you, or we'll say very clearly that he's doing Dragnet or he was doing Dragnet for the 1990s. And the fact that like we have so much of like the Dick Wolf oeuvre that's also on television, like it's still really key right now for broadcast television to make shows like that because they fit the model so well. And there have been streaming procedurals. Bosch is one of them, probably the most prominent one I can think of. But because of the format of Dragnet was so reliable and so useful for a broadcast schedule that's also part of it. So one of the things that makes it influential is that it was pretty good, but another thing that made it influential was that it really fit the medium. And we can see that in its persistence, right? That's why the schedule is filled up with procedurals, because you can have a format that is stable but flexible, repeatable for Dragnet, like 35 weeks in a year. For television today, 20 to 23 weeks or whatever episode seasons they're ordering now, like 8 episodes. Now it's like probably 8 episode series, whatever. But that it really works for like a broadcast schedule. And so I think it's a live question. And then as like broadcast continues to change and maybe kind of wither, where the police procedural format will be useful in a streaming environment. I think that's a continuous kind of conversation.
And it's interesting because I think, we talk about the police procedural serving as, this idea of Copaganda, which is a very, serious and very, important conversation to have. And I feel like the only police procedural that has sort of gestured at reckoning with that was Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which I think is they talked about their final season, like just making them all firefighters. And it's so interesting to me that like, I think that show certainly is in the vein of Dragnet. And I, like kind of thinking about how Dragnet was not about, solving these major crimes every single week necessarily. It was more about like the, quotidian, like day-to-day small potatoes kind of stuff. And I think Brooklyn Nine-Nine tried to take that and just make it like, well, a lot of that stuff is kind of, goofy, whatever. Like,
comic.
Yeah.
Great observation that there are shows that capture the quotidianness of just like anybody else's work, right? Like mostly it's emails, right? Like there are moments, but but mostly it's like moving files around in order to get to that time. So the way that captures like the quotidianness of that kind of work, I think is really kind of a useful comparison to make. I think there are a couple of things that Brooklyn Nine-Nine has that like Dragnet has. Like one is comedy. Like Dragnet can be quite funny, but it takes police work very seriously. So since it does that, it cannot really be in a position to question its own structures. There's no avenue for it to ask, well, is what we're doing here right or good? So I think if I'm memory of Brooklyn Nine-Nine is that after the murder of George Floyd, I think that's what you're referring to, like turning them all into firefighters. After the murder of George Floyd, a number of showrunners were kind of publicly thinking about how can our show reflect this reality that we're encountering right now. And Brooklyn Nine-Nine had avenues to do that because it wasn't as invested in that distilled idea of the police that is true of the most strict procedurals, and also that it was about characters. And Dragnet had iconic characters, but they did not have deep characterization.
Yeah.
These functionaries, right? They end up being really representatives of the system. So a procedural like that, a procedural like Dragnet, cannot question its structure, or the show doesn't exist, right? It immediately falls apart. So Dragnet could not, and I guess we see this in like Law and Order and the FBI's, right? There might be some slight conversation about certain challenges. I think the new Law and Order reboot, I might have had it like when they brought back Law and Order. I think I'm remembering there were some conversations within the show about a new policing environment, but like that a police procedural cannot incorporate a radical change to thoughts about policing. It just can't do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting how we have this, because we're having to reconcile the idea of like this social structure of the police is correlated with this, TV structure that is like they're sort of in service of each other, where people's ideas about the police come from the TV shows that they're consuming less than what's going on around them.
Yeah, for people who don't have regular interactions with the police, I would say there are certain communities that like have the knowledge to kind of to push back against those narratives. But for many of us, we're in the fortunate position of not engaging regularly with the police, of not being stopped, of not being, kind of over policed in our own neighborhoods. And so that so for those of us who are in that position, then our knowledge of the police comes from other sources, including this version of it.
Right. And then you mentioned another one of my favorite sort of like anti Dragnet shows, The Shield, and sort of how that being another, explicitly LA show really captures a side of the LAPD that is certainly infamous, both then and now. And just sort of how that took a very different form of police realism.
That's right. That's right. And it's very explicitly not a procedural.
Right.
It's a police, but it doesn't have the procedural form. And that enables it to focus on this character, like what's Vince's last name?
Vic Mackey.
Mackey, there we go. Yeah. Focus on Vic Mackey and like have him be the representative for an out of control police force. And like, so that means that the story can just do a lot of different things that the format of the procedural can't do. And the format of the procedural can't do ideologically, like as I was suggesting or arguing, like that the procedural form can't have that kind of a character in it. Like, it just like it can't, like that character is going to be contained and expelled by the procedural format. But as you're pointing out, like Vic Mackey is like an exaggerated portrayal, but also Rampart happened. Like the things that Sean Ryan, right? The incidents that inspired Sean Ryan to write that show, to create that show, were real incidents, like real miscarriages of justice, real vice in the police force. And so in order to create a show based on things like that, like that you end up with maybe a more operatic version of a police story, but it has its own, as you say, it has its own kind of realism because it's trying to engage with like operatic levels of police corruption.
And almost functioning as an anti-Dragnet in the sense that when you do see the quote unquote procedure, a lot of times it is explicitly not the written procedure. Like I think it's in the first or second episode, they're questioning a guy who, in conjunction with an abducted young girl, and Vic Mackey's like, oh, I'll figure it out. And so all you see is him turn off the camera in the interrogation room, grab a phone book, and then he walks out and he's like, all right, she's here. The implication being he just beat the tar out of this guy. And so it's like Joe Friday would never, but it's
Right.
like, we're seeing two sides of, this supposed realism.
And particularly just to like put that in context of that time in television as well, is a series of shows that give you men acting badly. And it's like, and that the setup is this show is different from other versions of it you've seen. And so that the pilot sets up that kind of turn. So you
Yeah.
think the surprise is going to be about this, but then actually we see this surprise. Or you think Mad Men, you see, like, you think that this man is this gray flannel suit character is going to act like this, and then there's a kind of turn. And so the Shield definitely does that for the police procedural. You're used to seeing Joe Friday types. We're going to see something very different.
Especially, I think that started in like 2001. So The Sopranos had been on for maybe 2 years at that point, but we were very early into the Prestige era. And I mean, I didn't have HBO, so it's like, you know,
right, for some of us.
Yeah, for some of us, it's like, what the hell is this? You know, like,
yeah, we needed FX for that. Yeah.
So, of course, we like to end every episode with a book recommendation and a film recommendation. Our book recommendation, of course, is Only the Names Have Been Changed, Dragnet, The Police Procedural and Postwar Culture by Dr. Claudia Calhoun. For our film recommendation, I'm going to hand it over to you. And you actually have something a little bit new for the film recommendation. You have a radio recommendation.
Right, like Dragnet, you enabled me to kind of break the format of what came before. And so I wanted to suggest to anybody who wanted to just have a different media experience to go back and listen to some of those radio Dragnet episodes, and to be maybe surprised, maybe pleased, maybe interested by, as I said before, how much of the show is present on radio. If you have an iPhone or a smartphone, there's a bunch of apps. They're called sometimes they're called old time radio. That's what the collectors will call these collections of shows, and they'll have like Dragnet within an old time radio server. You can also go to archive.org, which has hundreds of Dragnet episodes, and I think they're still good fun to listen to. So not just for historical purposes, but you also may find that Dragnet still pretty good.
You know, I'm realizing now, did Jack Webb, he must have seen the 87 movie because he was still alive, right? Or had he just passed away?
Check those dates. I think he might have passed away. Yeah, he died in 82.
I would. So, I wonder.
It's an interesting question. I don't know whether he would have found that funny or not.
And I wonder if it's one of those things where it's like it was only possible because he was dead.
I don't know. At some point, he lost control of his shows. So in terms of like who owned the IP,
right?
I'm not sure at that time who owned it. He didn't lose control. He sold. I take that back. Like he bought a pool or something.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah. So I'm not sure if he had to have. But I also don't want to give the impression that he was a humorless person.
Right.
Like his character. He seemed to have had friends and people seemed to have liked him.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe he would have also gotten a lot of joy out of that.
Should we recommend the movie as well? It's fun, but it's like it's so different, you know, and it's like I think it only works I think it really works best for people who like watched the show to see it as sort of like a counterpoint to the show. Like I think it only works playing off of the show's aesthetic.
I think that's right. I think just as in 1954, what's most interesting about the movie is if you want to see what the television show looks like at 3 times the length and in color, you know, in 50s color as opposed to 60s color. It's not a bad movie. I don't think it's as like interesting or snappy as the radio shows. Like I would say, like put on the radio show while you're cleaning, and that's probably a better experience than sitting down and watching the film. Although I don't want to discourage anybody from watching the film. It's not a bad film. It's an entertaining film.
Yeah. Well,
if you
because we reference it, you know, I feel like we've referenced it like 4 or 5 times on this show, but I'm realizing I haven't watched it in like, I don't know, probably 25 years at this point. I'm afraid to go back and find out it stinks.
Yeah, it's okay. I think this, like, the Dragnet is really good at 24 minutes, you know, or 28 minutes, you know? And then at 87 minutes, it's like, oh, there's a lot of Dragnet here.
It's kind of like that fourth season of Arrested Development where it's like, hey, the episodes don't have to be 22 minutes. Well, they probably should be.
Yeah, they don't have to be 41 either.
Mhm. Dr. Claudia Calhoun, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great to be in conversation with you.
Ruth Powers was tried in Springfield Superior Court. The judge dismissed her ex-husband's auto theft charges and forced him to pay all back child support. Mr. Powers blamed the outcome on his lawyer, one Lionel Hutz. Lionel Hutz, a.k.a. Miguel Sanchez, a.k.a. Dr. Nguyen Van Thok, was paid $8 for his 32 hours of babysitting. He was glad to get it. Marge Simpson was charged with a violation of Penal Code Section 618A, wanton destruction of precious antique cans. She was ordered to pay 50 cents to replace the cans and $2,000 in punitive damages and mental anguish. Homer Simpson was remanded to the custody of the United States Army Neurochemical Research Center at Fort Meade, Maryland, for extensive testing.
Our two top-rated episodes so far and away compared to the other numbers, are about Harry Morgan in one way or another. So I have a feeling this is going to be one of our top-rated episodes.
Well, I guess MASH. It makes sense, MASH.
Yeah.
Probably. But yeah, Harry Morgan shows up everywhere.
Mhm.